I am curious, though Douglas, I'm going to jump right into my curiosities with you when you see London, and as you're expected to see Germany today, and maybe on a smaller scale, but we saw it in New York as well. Columbus, Circle, Grand Central Station. How do you explain what you're seeing in the West as a rally, as a celebration of, as you have said, Douglas, not just pro-Palestinian, but in your estimation, indistinguishable from promise rallies? Well, we know that they're pro-Hamas. More than half of the organizers of the London protest yesterday have links with him, as was reported in one of the national newspapers. So the idea that these are simply pro-peace rallies or something like that, it just doesn't hold up. And that's even before you go through the video of the crowds and of people calling for jihad, or people calling from the river to the sea, which of course means eradication of the State of Israel. Even before all that, you know, it should be obvious what these marches, in fact, are. They're mainly made up of two groups of people. The majority are Muslims, and people who the Muslim faith, who always feel incredibly raised whenever Israel is involved in the conflict, and never come out on the streets when their fellow Muslims are being massacred in Yemen, Syria, or anywhere else. But there's also a sort. Second and smaller group in these crowds in Britain, in Berlin, as in America, which is a group of sort of far leftists who basically use this strange imposition of American, recent interpretation of American history and put it on to the Middle East, which is why you hear people talking about colonialism and, First Peoples and much more. It's a real demonstration of incredible ignorance. You know, you were obviously one of the people that's been talking for a long time about illegal immigration in Europe, and sort of this displacement of Western values without having assimilated these massive amounts of people that came into the country and into the continent over the last, 10 years. Are these protests in some way waking up the British people? Or is this sort of like, is there an acceptance that this is who we are now? I think it is waking something up, but there's an enormous strategic problem. You see, which is, the first people who turn out in protest against these protesters are already rightly or wrongly, but it's a judgment call described as, far-right thugs and much more. And of course that means that much of the reporting from yesterday, for instance, refers to anyone who's patriotic and British, who turns out against the Hamas protest. They're called far-right thugs, and all the Hamas supporters are described as peaceful protesters. So it's a totally upside-down world. But I do think that the reaction of the police to some of those counter-protesters yesterday, and the nature of some of those counter-protesters, is going to scare off a lot of other British people from appearing on the streets. Turning out on the streets and saying we just don't like this, so, I've always had a great faith in the American public to be able to turn out and counter terrorism on their streets and on our streets in America. But it's much, much more complex in Britain and in Europe, where people are just cowed, I think, into believing, we've sort of all got to get along somehow, and that includes the people who call for the eradication of the Jews. I mean, it's just lamentable that it should get to this Doug here in America. When we look at the protests that we see, there's an Ohio University professor who basically is supposed to be the professor of Islam and peace, and he's calling for the desolation of Israel, calling to get rid of it completely, and very radical things. So when we see these protests here in our country, most of what we see are a lot of I'm a little bit of a stereotype here, middle-class white liberals that are under the age of 25, a lot of young kids in college being indoctrinated in some way that doesn't even have life context to apply to this issue when we look at Europe. Is it a similar thing? Is it an indoctrination from the university? Is it the young that are coming out and are, or more a canvas, that's more easily painted? You know what are the demographics there? To a great extent it is, but it really is, American education that does most failed people here. I think, British universities, all the problems they have, do not have the kind of indoctrination which has led us to see scenes as we have at university after university in the US. After the biggest massacre of Jews, since the Holocaust Jewish students at us, universities are the ones being hounded. How on earth did that happen? It's much worse. Actually, in America at that level, in Germany, that would not be allowed, and there would be a much stronger response, I hope. There's a strong response in America to this, too. Yeah, you're right, Douglas. But I still think whether or not we're talking about Germany, France, the UK, or the US, there's this self-immolation. There's this apology for being the West. Somebody's going to have to step up and champion the greatest set of values and civilization, that the planet's ever seen somebody. Some point's gonna have to step up and champion the West. Yeah, Douglas, I want to jump right into some. First of all, you wrote the following, the New York Post. It's up right now on a visit to Israel. I have seen the horror that the world must never forget. I know you've seen, some of this footage, and I want to jump right into, a debate that the viewers watching right now won't have the background on. You were on Pies, Morgan, and you had this really, I think, a very interesting point. You weren't comparing atrocities nor soft-pedaling the atrocities of the Nazis, but you said even the Nazis, doing what was so awful, knew what they were doing to some extent was awful, in that they tried to cover up their crimes or their soldiers. And this is historically accurate of the SS had to do drugs and alcohol to get away with their own moral atrocities. And I'm sure not all of them, but this was this is a historical fact. It's why they moved to the camps, because the soldiers became so destroyed from what they were doing. And you were comparing this to what you've seen in Israel. Right now, because you're saying Hamas is proud of what they did, there's no similar, shame, yes. I mean, this is no way, as you say, to soft-pedal the atrocities of narcissism, but it is a curiosity of the Hamas videos, and the footage they took that day, as well as the reaction of Hamas leaders, since that they are proud of what they've done. They are proud. If you see the unedited footage, as I, sadly have of the 7th of October attacks, never mind what you can gather from going to the Kabbat Sim again, in the sites of the massacres, as I have, you will know that an additional obscenity of what occurred, and what Hamas wants to keep occurring, is that the terrorists were so proud of what they were doing as they were doing it, calling their parents back in Gaza and saying, "Look, Father, I've killed 10 Jews with my own hands, get mother on the line. I want to tell her how great her son is." I mean, as I say, it's not to downplay any atrocities, but just to say the world needs to realize, this is that Hamas is not just a genocidal organization, a would-be genocidal organization, but one that actually relishes its barbarism and sadism, and I think that the world needs to realize that is the case. It's a it. I don't know what the takeaway from that is, but it is a stark and ugly reality. The minute I saw you say it's like you're right, like what do we do with an organization that takes pride in what we just saw happen? If we know anything for the last 2 decades, radical Islamic terrorist is a fire. You just can't just stomp out. Yeah, and I know the answer, by the way. To my own question, you destroy that organization. You destroy that ideology, Douglas Murray. Thank you for joining us. I'm Steve Dewey, I'm Brian, Kill Me, and I'm May. Art, and click here to subscribe to the Fox News YouTube page to catch our hottest interviews and most compelling analysis.